It was International Women's Day this week, and to mark the day, one major Australian company closed their gender pay gap. Energy Australia is spending $1.2 million to boost the pay packets of 350 women who are being paid less than their male colleagues.
However, the pay gap in Australia is still on average at 17.3% a year. To discuss this and more from Canberra, we're talking with Denita Wawn, Chief Executive of the Master Builders Association, and here in the studio, Cassandra Goldie, Chief Executive of the Australian Council of Social Services. Welcome to both of you.
Good morning.
Cassandra, an opportunity this past week, given International Women's Day, to reflect on gender equality. We're focusing on that pay gap. It hasn't really moved much in the past 2 decades. Why is that?
Well, we've got this entrenched barrier where culturally we've still got a lot of resistance to flexible work in workplaces. We've got a culture of still secrecy around pay rates, and I've met many women who've said, when I found out that my colleague male was earning more than me, the shock about that, not having transparency about pay, and of course access to decent, affordable childcare, which often is a real sort of brake on full participation in the workplace. And so it is really entrenched, but hallelujah, Catherine Tanner, what a sensational move for her. I think a lot of women around Australia smiled and said, well, that's it. You can do it. It does cost dollars to close the pay gap, and she's committed to tracking that and keeping an eye on it. And we should really congratulate her leadership there, because it will take dollars to close this, and we should be doing it.
That's in regards to Energy Australia, that decision made
That's
for
right.
women doing the same job as their male counterparts. Do you think we'll see that continue with other companies?
Well, I think this is a message to other employers to say it's not enough to say, look, the women of Australia, go out there and learn to negotiate better. I mean, we should be valuing the style of negotiation which comes into a workplace to say, I will take other factors into account. It's not all about me. But in the end, for employers to take responsibility to say, we are committed to full equality. We're going to regularly track this. We're going to make sure that we've got transparency over our arrangements, and when a gap emerges, and we've clearly got one, we're prepared to put the dollars in, and Catherine Tanner's shown it can be done.
So, Denita, we've seen that example from Energy Australia. How do you encourage businesses to follow suit?
Around like-for-like pay, but for us it's actually a bigger issue than that. You look at gender pay gap, and part of the issue is that women generally work in lower paying industries. That's why we've been pushing for women to enter our industry. We're one of the highest paying industries in Australia. We only have 10% of a female workforce, and that is not acceptable. We have huge employment growth opportunities, and so we think our focus as an industry association is very much to encourage women to look at building and construction, the breadth of jobs available, and the fact that it is a well-paid job relative to other industries around the country. And we think that would make a significant difference to the issue around gender pay equity.
Yeah, you mentioned only 10% of women employed in that sector. Why is that then? Is that perhaps because of that perception that it's physically demanding and perhaps more suited to men?
Well, that is a perception that we need to erode, because it's certainly not the case. Yes, there are physical jobs, but obviously work health and safety requirements dictate that we need to ensure that all people, women and men, can undertake those tasks. And I note only with the 10% workforce, only 1% of our trade workforce are women, and yet there are huge opportunities with the growth in the industry. So there's a breadth of jobs, increasing growth in paraprofessional work in our industry, and a great deal of flexibility. So we're very keen to not only break those barriers down about misconceptions by women, their peers and their parents, but also look at ourselves and ensure that we are encouraging women as opposed to discouraging women into the industry.
Cassandra, it's of course great to get women into building and those construction jobs which are higher paid, but you see professions like teaching or nursing that are dominated by women, and they aren't necessarily paid as well. there's also a problem there, isn't there?
Oh, look, absolutely. And Denita, you're quite right. Of course, we've got a really sort of gender-skewed approach to different industries. So Denita's industry, as you say, we've got a very low proportion of women involved in that kind of work. And on the flip side, when you come to caring work, community services work, human services, we've got 83% is female. So it's very highly female-dominated and typically very low paid. And so this is the big structural problem we've got as well. And so we think it's time for us to again say the gender stereotyping, it begins at a very young age about, what boys and girls would be attracted to. We've got to really roll up our sleeves on that. It's not about political correctness. This is about really having all young people open their minds to the kind of work they'd like to be involved in and making sure that we're dealing with the cultural barriers that make it feel uncomfortable for men and for women to go into work that's dominated by the other gender, because I think we want to see this kind of flexibility, which will then, we believe, help in closing the gender pay gap as well.
Denita, you mentioned the example of your sector. That brings us to our next subject, the Reserve Bank report this past week, looking at one of the reasons why housing and homes are so unaffordable in many of our cities around the country, and it's citing poor and inefficient planning driving up those house prices. What's the solution in your book?
Well, we think it's really simple but difficult. It's a collaborative approach required by all levels of government to really target what are the barriers. The Reserve Bank report was absolutely right. It reinforced some work we did last year that said restrictive zoning practices were significantly increasing the cost of land, as is developer supplies, developer charges, and also land supply. So we're very supportive of the government's city deals approach. A number of agreements have been reached with local government, state government and the federal government to really target why there is cost restrictions on land and how we can resolve that. And it's a combination of allowing high, medium and low density housing in appropriate areas that will then reduce those costs. We'd estimated if you reduce the zoning restrictions alone, 20,000 extra homes could be built over the next 5 years. And we know that we need an additional 200,000 homes in Australia to meet current demand, let alone what those population increases we're going to face over the next few years.
Cassandra, what role does zoning practices take, and is there a problem with them, how they currently are?
Well, of course, planning and zoning is really crucial for us. We know that bad development leads to really bad outcomes, and so we think we need to have it's not just about removing restrictions. I think Denita would hopefully agree with me that we want to see good development here, which has the right kind of social infrastructure planned into it. So when you're expanding the number of houses, people have to live in them. We've got children in those houses, and we've seen, I think, examples of where we're really concerned that we don't have the kind of social infrastructure investment in there as well. But I think the Reserve Bank made it very clear that it's both the zoning but also the really rapid increase in demand. So this is about supply and demand, and our view is that we've got to tackle some of the measures that are fueling demand, and we're very clear. We do think we need to roll back negative gearing arrangements and reduce the capital gains discount over time that we think is continuing to fuel the speculative property investment and continuing to push up housing prices. I mean, it's been a radical increase in housing prices, and of course wages and income support has almost frozen in this period. It's really concerning.
We are almost out of time. Cassandra, I know you're very concerned with an issue you want to bring up at the moment is the Indigenous Work for the Dole scheme, effectively known as the Community Development Program. And some figures this past week, there's been some 400,000 fines. How many people are actually participating in the program?
Well, it's just 33,000. I wanted us to talk about this morning because, yes, it is happening out of sight, out of mind for so many, in the capital cities. These are in more remote communities, predominantly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people affected, crushing financial penalties because people who are not able to get a job are being required to work for the dole at almost three times the rate of people in the cities. and the financial penalties are out of control. And many Indigenous leaders, we're really concerned. The ACTU is out again as well, saying we have to shut down the most severe financial penalties. You can be cut off for 8 weeks, no income at all. We need to make sure that we've got the right kinds of services in those communities. We're deeply disturbed by this. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations are saying we want to support people into real work. Work for the dole is not suitable for these areas and it needs to be shut down.
Denita, what changes would you like, if any, to this community development program?
I think Sandra's made a good point about making sure that people are job ready. We've just recently conducted some pilot programs on pre-apprenticeships where we recognised that a lot of people, particularly those unemployed, really were quite confronted with the concept of a 3 or 4 year apprenticeship and weren't really aware of what the obligations would be. And so we've been running short course pre-apprenticeships, and that has made a significant difference in people's understanding of work opportunities and work commitments. So employers want people that are job ready. I think taxpayers understand the concept of mutual obligation, but Cassandra's right, we've got to get that balance right, and I think people like Cassandra and I need to probably spend more time working together to find some solutions rather than relying on governments.
There we go, there's the invitation. Denita Wawn and Cassandra
I think we're all agreed work for the dole is a failed experiment and a waste of good, taxpayer money. So let's talk more, Denita.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks both for joining us.